Thank you. So it is also important to know that today's event is centered on Indigenous voices. So please remember to make space for any Indigenous voices if you are non-Indigenous, first and foremost. Our town hall hopes to open discussion on the topic of human right to housing and what it means for Indigenous peoples and the relationship they have with Canada. So we will have time for a really well-rounded discussion and conversation with the advocate herself. But before we do that, I would like to welcome our elder Sally Matthias to open our event today, if she's here. Hopefully she's here now.
I don't think Sally has gotten connected yet, Katlia, so maybe we can have some opening words from Marie, and then as soon as Sally joins, we'll have her present as well.
Ani bonjour Watier. Mani McGregor Pitwan Kut Dijnakas. Nishnabe Kwendao, Doganing Donjaba. Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to have you all join us. And my name is Marie McGregor Pitawanakot. I'm a Anishinaabe Kwe, living in Doganing. English name is South Bay, Wikwemekong, Manitoulin Island, northeastern Ontario. And I'd like to offer some words of welcome. And we ask the Creator for guidance, direction, and support, and for all of us to be able to, let's imagine that we have a smoke in front of us, whether it's sage or tobacco or cedar or sweetgrass, and we'll use our hands. Imagine that smoke wafting over your head, and what you're asking for is clear thinking. Now imagine that smoke going over your ears, and what you're asking for is clear thinking. Clear hearing, being able to hear, and also being able to listen. Now imagine wafting that smoke over your eyes so that you're able to see clearly. And then imagine wafting the smoke over your mouth so that the things that you say and that you say today are said with good intent. And imagine now wafting the smoke over your heart. And what this signifies is that you're asking for good intent, good purposes. And then if we were in person in a circle together, we would waft the smoke over our entire body. And what you're asking for then is to be able to, everything that you do today is done in a good way and for good purposes. So that's the intent that I'm bringing to it today. The other thing I would like to do is to acknowledge the land that we're on. In our language, we call it Anishinaabe Ake, which means Anishinaabe land. And because this is a gathering of peoples from many areas, I'd like to acknowledge the now disappeared Beothuk from Newfoundland, Labrador. That's their territory. The Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia. The Montagne Naskapi and the peoples from the north, where Katlia is from. And the many nations in what is now British Columbia. I understand that there were hundreds at one point. There may now be maybe 50, 60 nations left. And also Cree territory that stretches across northern Ontario, northern Manitoba, northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, and also Anishinaabe territory, parts of the Great Lakes, northern Ontario, Minnesota, Wisconsin, parts of North Dakota, parts of Manitoba, parts of Saskatchewan, and also the Blackfoot people out on the plains, and many other nations whose territories that we live on. We acknowledge them, and we recognize that those are their territories. So on that note, I would like to stop for the moment. We have done our opening remarks, opening ceremony. And we've also done our land acknowledgement, and I turn the floor back to Katlia Chimiwech.
Masi Cho, thank you, Marie. We actually do have Elder Sally Matthias here now with us, thankfully. So we will open the floor to her to do an opening for us so that she can this group can be led in a good way.
Greetings. Isaiah, turn yours off, please. What? Greetings. My grandchildren heard that I was doing a prayer, and they are now singing prayer song in the background. So we have a bit of a challenge in vocals over in this end, and I do apologize for that. Creator, we lift up our peoples to you, the challenges that our communities have. Help those that have come to hear your voice, to see your goodness, to know their helpers, to know what you've given them, to walk and make good decisions. And we do thank you for all of these things. May we hear your voice. May we know your love and see with your eyes to understand in these things. Oh, may which.
Masicho, Sally, thank you so much. And I can relate. I have noisy teenagers and pets and all sorts of things. So, and that's really sweet that they were wanting to sing and be a part of this. So I'm actually going to turn it back to Marie. Marie is now going to present on human rights and what they mean for Indigenous peoples in Canada who hold a distinct nation-to-nation relationship with the Crown. And again, Marie is an advocate and has previously led the Secure Indigenous Land Tenure Association Conference. So she's doing so much great work.
Thank you, Katlia. So as said, my name is Marie, and I'd like to talk about Indigenous human rights, both individual and collective. And where I want to start with is right at the beginning. And what I want to say about this is that the Great Spirit, or the Creator, placed Anishinaabeg. And I'll make reference to Anishinaabeg. And in the instance of this gathering, I'd like to include all Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast, placed Indigenous peoples here on Mother Earth. And because I can only speak from the point of view of being an Anishinaabe Kwe, I can talk about those parts of those teachings. Anishinaabe are part of all creation, no more or less than the animals, the birds, the fish, the insects, the underground beings, and the unseen. Unseen with a capital U, because we don't know who they are. Anishinaabe have our own laws given to us by the Great Spirit. But some of those given to us by the Great Spirit, which we practice to this day. Anishinaabe have our own lands, again given to us by the Great Spirit. But some of those lands are currently occupied by settlers. Now, this is a direct quote from Wilkins and Langawemu. The treaty-based relationship that Britain, Spain, and France established with tribes throughout Canada and the United States recognized tribes as sovereign nations, therefore legally placing them on equal ground with these governments. And this is an important thought, because those treaties have not been disassembled or taken out or withdrawn. Indigenous peoples, being on equal ground with settler governments, possess human rights, both individual and collective. In addition to rights, Anishinaabe hold responsibilities to ourselves, to our families, to our clans, and to our nation. For men, one of the responsibilities is to take care of fire. For women, one of the responsibilities is to take care of water. Our collective rights are to support one another to ensure the continued existence of Anishinaabe. This we have been able to do. I'd like to read you another direct quote that is most pertinent to this discussion. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, enshrines Indigenous peoples' collective rights to lands, resources, territories, and in Article 14 also specifically states that all rights recognized under the Declaration apply equally to men and women. Further, UNDRIP is underpinned by international human rights law, including the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW for short. There is another convention, number 169, that also emphasizes that its provisions apply equally to men and women. And further, in Article 20 provides specifically for protection of women against unequal access to employment and against sexual harassment. So this came from Faring in 2013. I want to refer now to 3 instruments that are legally binding in international law. They are a treaty, a covenant, and a convention. A declaration is not legally binding. So UNDRIP can therefore be regarded as persuasive, but not authoritative. In addition, Indigenous peoples already hold human rights by virtue of our continued existence as peoples, by virtue of holding Indigenous allodial land title to our lands. Allodial can also be thought of as original or as underlying title. And by exercising our rights and responsibilities as Indigenous peoples. Some of these rights and responsibilities include the use and preservation of our languages, and in my case, Anishinaabe, the use and care of our plant medicines, the harvesting and management of our wildlife and fisheries, the provision of housing for ourselves, and the transmission of our knowledge of our history and our culture. I'd like to provide another direct quote. Canada has never proved it has legal or de jure sovereignty over Indigenous peoples, territories, which suggests that Canada is relying on the racist doctrine of discovery. And further, Canada has not ratified the ILO Convention number 169. This is taken from an author named John in 2014. The exercise of Indigenous human rights, whether individual or collective, cannot be denied to us because our human rights are contained in our continuing use of our traditional territories. The doctrine of discovery has been disproven. The Great Spirit has placed us here on Great Turtle Island, also known as the Americas. With this placement came roles, rights, and responsibilities. In our custom, Anishinaabe women were regarded equally with men. Each had roles to provide for ourselves, to defend ourselves, to provide food and medicines, to raise our young, to teach our youth, and to care for the old. Roles, rights, and responsibilities included managing systems of governance, managing our economies, and managing our international relations. That is, relations with other nations, other tribes. There's a document out there called Legislative Best Practices for Securing Women's Rights to Community Lands. And it reiterates some of our customs for using community lands. Okay, direct quote again. Recognize women's equal property rights. Recognize that married and unmarried women, as well as married and unmarried men, have equal rights regarding property and its acquisition, ownership, use, management, enjoyment, and disposition. Recognize equal rights between men and women to contract and to carry on business related to property. This is from Keene and others in 2018. And back to the idea of human rights, and also another concept called spiritual homelessness. This one was described by Jesse Thistle. He's now an academic at York University, but he has had the lived experience of homelessness. And he came up with this concept called spiritual homelessness. My interpretation of it is that Indigenous peoples see, if we don't remain on reserves or in Métis settlements, we see when we are traveling around Great Turtle Island, signs that say, no trespassing, keep out, or private property. When we see these notices prohibiting us from traveling in our homelands, it evokes a feeling of homelessness, not a physical homelessness, but a disconnection and a separation from our own territories. Lastly, redress in the form of confirming Indigenous women's rights to housing can be one way of undoing some of the harms that Indigenous women, many of whom are clan mothers, have experienced. In order to build a home, one needs land on which to build. So that's the connection between human rights and housing and land and being an Indigenous person, is they're all connected, they're related, they cannot be separated out, which is why, to me, this human rights claim is so important, because it needs to look at who we are as Indigenous people and our connection to our lands and territories. And it's on those lands and territories that we have the right to housing, to build our homes. On that note, Chimiwech, Misa Iu.
Masicho Marie. Marie has quite a lot of knowledge in those areas, and we will continue that important discussion in the breakout rooms. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Khulud Beg, who is the Policy Director of Keepers of the Circle, and she's going to do a brief presentation on the National Housing Strategy Act and the Housing as a Human Right legislation. So Khulud, take it away.
Thank you so much, Katlia, for putting me on. And I just would like to welcome everyone. I'm Khulud. I work with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and Keepers of the Circle, supporting the work that Marie and Katlia have been doing through the National Working Group. I'm situated out of Ottawa, which is the unceded, unsurrendered land of the Algonquin people. And very briefly and quickly, without taking much time, I just wanted to get folks oriented to what housing as a human right legislation is and how it has come to being and what it entails. And As we have the federal housing advocate, join us today at 2 p.m., I think it would be important that we do get a sense of what we're talking about and also engage with the National Housing Strategy Act as a legislation, which legislates housing as a human right within the Canadian Constitution. So I'm just going to play a quick video, and there's going to be a link to the video in French posted in the chat as well. After that, we're going to move into breakout rooms where we can just have conversation on what the presentation that Marie just led, and also conversation on housing as a human right. And I'll orient folks to the breakout rooms after the video. So quickly going to share my screen, and the links are going to be posted in the chat for French as well. Thank you.
Resident of Ontario who owes more than $6,000 in debt.
Housing is a fundamental human.
I hope everybody can hear and see it. And if you're having difficulty, please do let us know through chat.
Housing is a fundamental human right. Having a safe and secure place to call home helps people and families thrive and succeed. It is central to human dignity, well-being, and community. But a home is more than just a roof and four walls. It is protection from the elements, and it is a means to access basic services. It also keeps us safe and healthy. The right to housing means many things. For example, it means you're able to get adequate housing that is affordable and meets your needs. It means you can access housing without discrimination or harassment, and you feel safe in your home. It also means your home should be accessible, like if you have a disability or you're an older person. Many people in Canada still live in housing that does not meet these standards, and many do not have a place to live at all. The National Housing Strategy Act recognizes housing as a fundamental human right. It commits governments to focus on those in greatest housing need, to reform housing laws, policies, and programs through a human rights-based approach, and to involve communities in meaningful ways. The Act also establishes a national housing strategy with accountability tools to help develop and maintain the strategy, including the National Housing Council and the Federal Housing Advocate. The Federal Housing Advocate's mandate is to promote and protect the right to housing across Canada. The Advocate gives those impacted by housing need and homelessness a voice. The Advocate receives submissions from the public on systemic housing issues and uses that information to make recommendations to improve Canada's housing laws, policies, and programs. The Advocate can review the issue. In some cases, they will refer it to the National Housing Council. The Council will establish a review panel to examine the issue more closely and make recommendations. The Advocate doesn't help with individual disputes. If you need help resolving a dispute, you need to go to the Landlord Tenant Board or Human Rights Commission in your province or territory. To make a submission to the Advocate or to find out more about what we do, visit the housing page on the Canadian Human Rights Commission website.
So I'm hoping that was just helpful to get our minds into thinking about human rights and housing as a human right, and how we're going to have the conversation today.
So welcome back to the circle. I hope that we've all had some great discussion. This is really important discussion, and I wish that we had more time. But now we're actually going to be inviting the federal advocate herself into the room. So Marie Jose Ule, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this portion of our session. This is the question and answer portion. But I just wanted to introduce the advocate. She is an experienced leader who is recognized for her community activism, expertise in human rights, and extensive knowledge of the housing and homelessness system. Most recently, she was the executive director of Action Logment, an Ottawa housing loss prevention organization. Her diverse experience in the housing sector spans development consulting and project management for affordable housing developments, advocating for tenant rights at all 3 levels of government, and working with diverse partners to address human rights violations related to housing and homelessness. Building a sense of community and supporting and amplifying marginalized voices is particularly important to her. So welcome again, and we will now open the floor to discussion, and we'll take questions through the chat. So please raise your hand, or you can use the raise hand option. And please just be mindful to keep yourself muted throughout the chat. And we will call upon you, and then you can unmute yourself. And we're going to take as many questions as possible while we have the time. And we'll also open up the opportunity to do follow-up questions after this session as well. So we'd like to hear some opening remarks from you as well, Marie.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the kind invitation and the warm welcome. My name is Marie-Josée Oil. You can call me Marie or MJ or Marie-Josée, whatever is most comfortable for you. I grew up in Alberta, so believe me, no one called me Marie-Josée growing up, so that's all good. But I would like to acknowledge the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. From coast to coast to coast, I acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis that call this land home. And as we discuss housing, it is important that we recognize colonial policies and systems that perpetuate dispossession and violence. So just over a month ago, I reached the 6-month mark of my new role, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to report on some of my work so far and share some thoughts on the priorities and challenges ahead for advancing the right to adequate housing in Canada. So as I embark on my role as the federal housing advocate, it's an opportunity to address this longstanding issue of Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people being denied their human right to adequate housing. So I want to make it clear that my role is as an independent, nonpartisan watchdog, and it's part of my job description to criticize the government and hold it to account. Implicit in my role is the duty to amplify the voices of people experiencing inadequate housing and homelessness and holding governments accountable. So I am here to learn, here to listen, and here to work together to advance your priorities and find meaningful solutions.
Yes, thank you so much. So we have a great group of participants that have a lot of great feedback from our breakout room discussions. So if anybody wants to begin the question and answer period, please just raise your hand, and any comments or concerns or questions you have for Marie, that's what she's here for. So this will also possibly be taken into consideration as evidence for her work going forward. And apologies if I do not see any hands up, because I can't see everyone in the screen.
I'm wondering if we can start with a question that was posed in one of the breakout rooms, Katlia, which is asking, what can the advocate do about the encampment teardowns happening across the country?
Okay, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I just came back from a BC tour, and I did spend some time in encampments in Victoria, in Vancouver, and in Prince George. And not only did we eat with the people in encampments, we talked to the people themselves as well as advocates. What is it that they want for their housing, and why is the housing system failing them? Why are they voting with their feet, basically? We recognize that being an encampment is a huge violation. Well, the fact that encampments exist is the system is broken. The housing system is failing people, and it is a big result of failures and that housing as a human right is not respected for people. But to have governments propose solutions or make bold statements that say, well, these people, we've been offering them housing, we've been finding them housing. Obviously, the offers of housing are not meeting their needs. So it was really important to find out what is it that they're looking for, or why are these options failing them? And we found quite a few really interesting answers. That being said, so we're about to, we're going to eventually have a report on these on the trip. So, but I think engaging first and foremost is one, but also we sent letters to a few mayors across the country who are reporting, or we're hearing through the media, that they're going to take action in one way, shape, or form around encampments that we fear are violations of their human right to be there, first of all, and refer them to the shift directives on how to properly engage with people in encampments. We're hearing things of huge concern, and AFN had written a report on sweeps, especially in Prince George, of heavy-handedness, of using bylaw officers to just keep people uncomfortable, so that they never, to try to discourage encampments or destroy possessions of people that they need to survive, in ways, to keep them from being there and from returning. The big issue of concern, however, for me, and especially in Prince George, is regardless of where the women are, they're not safe. They're not safe in encampments. They're not safe in some of the housing options that are offered to them. And even while we were in Prince George, a few of the women we were talking to were saying that they suspected that 2 women or girls that they knew are suspected to be missing. So it's very distressful. But you're not here to hear me say that, that.
All right, we have another question. Thank you, by the way. There's a lot of work to be done around encampments. This is a comment and a question. So you may have heard that in Edmonton, supportive housing units sit unoccupied because of a lack of financial support from the provincial government to staff the buildings. Homeward Trust and the City of Edmonton are now scrambling to find $11 million that was supposed to come from the provincial government. What can the federal government do to compel provincial governments to ensure these projects are successful by providing funding? And not only that, one step further, I think in our group, there was talk about municipal governments as well. So how can those 3 governments support each other?
Oh, wow. Having grown up in Edmonton, you have no idea how angry this makes me to hear this. That being said, it's like, this is a shared jurisdiction. And so, no one can, well, the goal is for everyone to enjoy their human right to adequate housing, and that means working cooperatively with all levels of government and other duty bearers, well, including the private sector. So inadequate housing and homelessness are complex, they're structural, and they're systemic problems, and they do span the three levels of government. And in Canada, supporting the human right to adequate housing for all, it's shared responsibility between all levels of government, and it requires collaboration and a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples and governments, and the alignment with a united declaration of the rights of Indigenous people. But, this shared responsibility is enshrined in international law that all governments in Canada are required to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to adequate housing. And, that international human rights treaties and obligations apply equally at all 3 levels of government. You're speaking specifically of Edmonton, but, quite frankly, the federal government, with its roles as the big purse, needs to have some strings, first of all, and, to really convene some tables. That the goals must be achieved once and for all, that that we have, the way things are phrased is that it's a supply issue, but what you're talking to me is not about a supply issue, it's a capacity issue. And we were hearing a lot of the same things in BC, except not necessarily that they weren't occupied, but people weren't being served. You know, that staff is, well, especially supportive housing, again, so understaffed that they're forced to have very punitive measures in place which violate human rights, such as security of tenure under the guise of ensuring work and safety compliance towards the people who are working there, and the lack of being able to even provide trauma-informed training for the people who work in supportive housing. So this is incredibly distressing for me to hear, but you know, it's to put pressure on the federal minister and to have these discussions, and for us to be inserted at the discussions of all three levels of government, the PT tables, the FDP tables, and as well as speaking about this through existing mechanisms such as you know, the FCM, or FMC, sorry. So we have to align these priorities, and human rights is really the place to start with that discussion.
Thank you. Another question we have here in the chat is, how will you, as a housing advocate, produce and distribute your annual reports to Parliament in convergence with the Auditor General's report in a manner that jointly holds ministers and departments to account?
Well, we have an annual report that's due every year before the end of April. We released our first one, and it was tabled in Parliament in June. And once it's tabled in Parliament, it is there for everyone to see. You know, it's not just in front of, you know, in front of Parliament, but also in front of the Senate. And we've had some Senate interest, which was great. So we've identified some advocates and some support at that level, which was a nice surprise, considering this was the very first report, and that this is a new mandate, and that I was appointed just over 6 months ago. That being said, you know, the Minister Hussein must respond within 120 days, and we look forward to that response. We're preparing also other kinds of reports. Like I said, around the BC trip, very soon we're going to be going up north as well. And these are not official reports, but they will include recommendations and places for more work. And so then these will be made public, and so they won't have to go to the minister directly and be there first until he's able to table it in Parliament. That way, it's a way of reaching other advocate groups and educating the public. So as much as, you know, reaching Parliament and the Auditor General, I think it is very important to speak about our observations, the discussions that need to be had, the pressures that need to be, you know, put on three levels of government, that it be out there, and that we join our voices with other advocates, and we help rights holders, you know, fight for their rights as well, and fight to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question coming through is, how will you respond to organizations such as the Aboriginal Housing Management Association in BC and other Indigenous-led organizations on their observations within the National Housing Strategy inconsistencies with progressive realization of the rights to housing as it relates to Indigenous women and girls, those with disabilities, and the LGBTQ communities?
Wow, that's a really, really big question. I think, you know, you're asking me about, you know, the key components for human rights-based approach to housing for Indigenous people. I think, first of all, you know, human rights, including Indigenous rights, well, they must be held. So they're just not nice to have. So in my role, I recognize the importance of reading the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People alongside the National Housing Strategy Act. Indigenous housing is an immediate and urgent priority for me. I think from, within my first week of my appointment, I sat down with my team and I came out and said, this is a priority. There is such a disproportionate amount of Indigenous peoples who are unhoused in this country, and regardless of where they're living. And so this is where we're going to be focusing, though we have to do it right, and certainly in line with UNDRIP and UNDRIP, the Act. And so, it was promising to see in the budget that there's going to be some money to increase investments for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit housing. For funds to launch the Northern Urban and Rural Strategy, the development of the UNDRIP Action Plan, and some proposed legislative changes. But we need to update the National Housing Strategy to conform with the National Housing Strategy Act and the UN Declaration Act. So to ensure that there's significant program funds dedicated to Indigenous housing, to ensure programs are designed in a way that they're accessible and appropriate for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit housing providers, as you mentioned, and integrate for an Indigenous by Indigenous approach. So the timelines of 5 to 7 years, they're a start, but quite frankly, what we're seeing is people are dying, and we can't wait. And and we also need long-term sustainable funding that's needed for transformative change. So we also need better federal government understanding and acceptance of its obligations and mechanisms of protection of the human right to adequate housing for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So for example, through treaties, their fiduciary duty, the right to self-government, and UNDRIP. And, as long as I can say that I'm pleased for the budget that it acknowledged the need to fund a consultation process for the development of an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. The funding provided for it will need to be augmented when it comes to implementation. And it's not just to build the housing, but to provide the support, to operate over the long term, but also provide the supports that people need in order to be successful in their housing. So, when we're looking at the components of a human rights-based approach, the solutions to inadequate housing must be grounded in human rights, including the Indigenous rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And as mentioned earlier, the right to housing requires, we mobilize all available resources to help people facing the most disadvantaged first, so that everyone can enjoy the right to housing in the shortest possible time. The delays time with construction or even filling units, this is a big concern. But, it also has to include and prioritize people experiencing homelessness and those living in inadequate housing. So it's clear to me that the housing inequalities experienced by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are violations of human right to housing that must be addressed in a matter of priority, and that they must be able to exercise the right to control and manage their own housing. So I feel like I'm repeating myself, but we really need to prioritize self-determination and the importance of Indigenous people right to determine their own housing institutions, programs, and policies, and their rights related to land, resources, and territories. And, as I said, even though the budget, some things were positive, it's not enough. So I think I'll stop there because I feel like I'm talking in circles a little bit here.
That's okay. You're emphasizing the point of it's Indigenous led, for Indigenous, by Indigenous too. Marie is got her hand up, so we'll go to Marie.
Hi, Marie.
Oh, I think you're muted, Marie.
Hi, my question relates to the lived experience of being denied housing on my own homeland. And what I found out is that Indigenous people still hold Indigenous allodial land title to ancestral territories. Do you see a way in your role to ensure that Indigenous land rights are coupled with or are woven into secure housing for Indigenous people? Is there a way to do that?
Wow. Marie, this is an amazing question. I'm not sure that I can answer that today, but I think bringing attention to this issue and, you know, just rereading the recommendations of the submission that was made, you know, I think we need to create spaces which you've asked for through working groups to have this discussion and really look at how everything can be you know, the housing as a human rights can be leveraged in order to get to that goal. And I don't think it's a lofty one. I don't think it's one that's asking for too much or outside of human rights jurisdiction. So I think this is, you know, what was recommended, you know, to have these working tables. This is the place to do that. But thanks for bringing our attention to that. And you know, I'm really sorry to, you know, about that you do have the lived experience, but because you have the lived experience, you're able to best speak about the realities, what led to that, where the pitfalls were, where you have been failed. You know, by what levels of government or every, you know, all the barriers that you faced. And you know, with regards to, you know, we appreciate the submission or the claim because it's a very important starting point for us, but we also encourage everyone with lived experience to make a submission through our submission tool that can be accessed online, or we can, you know, mail, we have paper copies or make paper copies available. We can't look at individual submissions, but we are looking at systemic issues and themes. But also for us, when we do embark on reviews, whether internally or you know, make a request to National Housing Council to form a review panel to look at a systemic issue, the people who make submissions around a certain topic that is going to be addressed will be contacted to provide further information or to even be heard directly by the review panel or by us. But it's also a way to ensure that people recognize themselves in our work, that their voices, that they hear themselves speaking, because, you know, you are the experts in all of this. And I know that people have spoken over and over and over again. I feel terrible feeling, you know, asking once again to have people share their experiences with us, because I know you have. But this, you know, our engagement tool is, it's one of the ways that we engage with people. For us, it's a really important way to get a broader view of what's happening specifically in certain areas. I grew up in Alberta. I was born in Quebec. I live just north of Ottawa. I lived a little bit in Halifax, but I'm not an expert in all of the regions. You are, you know, you're the expert in your own region. So that's one thing that I would dare ask of anyone who might be interested. And humbly so, that I ask just to help us do our work and also work together to realize the right to housing for everyone.
Thank you, Marie. And Marie, Marie's question was actually very, very vital to the conversation about land title and underlining title that the Crown has laid claim to illegally and fraudulently. They have not conquered Canada at all. So that's an ongoing conversation, this underlining title conversation of Aboriginal rights and title. So that's important, I think, to keep note of when we're talking about land dispossession as well. And I think that leads us really well into the conversation about on reserve and off reserve. There was a question posed about whether or not you'll be including First Nations on reserve as there is housing crisis, whether it be no housing or housing that is in need of repairs. Band offices have policies and partnerships with banks that provide loans to build their own private homes. However, there is an exclusion for those living on reserve who do not have good credit. And if there is no down payment, then there is no home, which is also a barrier. So will the government on the federal level be addressed so that there is a surplus of housing funds to build social housing on reserve? And further to that, hopefully that social housing will really incorporate green living and passive income living so that those who are unsheltered or who are unable to work and have an income to provide rental market rent won't have to, because they won't be dependent on the system of living that we see ourselves in now that is actually very unaffordable.
Wow. First of all, with regards to the banking system, we do see it as a banking failure. We're heartened to see that on West Banks First Nation that people are actually able to access land leases, but this is very unique. And we're exploring of how this can be, first of all, used to access mortgages for people on other reserves because of the existing banking failure, and not just because of an affordability issue or a credit issue. But we also recognize that housing on and off community is the purview of all levels of government. This is, it's always been said, that on reserve, that it is, for a federal responsibility because of the relationship with the Crown. That being said, when we're talking about off community, that all three levels of government need to work together on that. With regards to social housing on community, that is something that that we feel, or I feel that social housing is not just 4 walls and a roof, that they play a significant role, if done well, of providing housing that is affordable in perpetuity. So it's not just inclusionary zoning, which will forcibly hold the developer responsible for a certain amount of years to maintain affordability of a certain amount of units for a certain amount of time. Though again, for nonprofits and social housing to be successful, they need to be properly funded as well for further capital repairs so that they don't fall into disrepair because they're cobbling together, or because they have trouble with their operating budgets. In terms of green builds, it's it is about long-term sustainability. Sometimes there is the danger of falling into green traps. I can speak as a developer of my own experience that some things look great on paper, but do they really also align with the way people live, especially with connection to the land and the outdoors? So those need to be looked at very carefully, but absolutely. And because of climate change, we need to make sure that the buildings that are being built are resilient and that are able to, meet people's needs again around heating and cooling, and that they are able to withstand, dramatic climatic events. And so that is quality housing, and not a lot of the modesty criteria that we saw in the development of social housing maybe a few decades ago. Building as much as possible as little cost as possible, because that doesn't work either, or it just kicks the problem further into the future.
Thank you so much for being able to address these questions, because they're very complex and you're doing a great job kind of parsing them out. So we have a lot of questions coming in about discrimination. And so many people are experiencing discrimination and exclusion as they search for housing. And one such example is around criminalization, or those who have been incarcerated and are released. Can you speak to that and how your office will address that?
Absolutely. My experience in housing loss prevention in Ontario, I had someone in our office at the time with Action Logement do help people with housing searches and making relationships with private market landlords. And then that position just became just impossible. They couldn't achieve anything. As I think landlords, while there was a vacancy, a very, very, very small, low vacancy in Ottawa, first of all, and there's just this with increased financialization, just trends that landlords felt that they can pick and choose, and they became overtly discriminatory, primarily Indigenous people, and then youth and people on social assistance, even though it was guaranteed income for the landlords. And we saw that in the ads. People would say that just, outright. And then came this program through Ottawa Crime Prevention about safe housing. And what the intention behind it was to create housing that was safe by having better lighting. And but then what it devolved into and caught on to was a way to discriminate further against people and allow landlords to do criminal background checks on their applicants. Of course, not taking into account that there's a disproportionate amount of policing people who are Indigenous people, disproportionate amount of people who are sentenced and spend time in corrections. But also, I think the conversation I had with a corrections officer once was the difference between him and the other COs and the people in the inside is that, people on the inside got caught or they got sentenced. And so it was not a way to guarantee safety for the people in the buildings, but it became a trend. It became very popular, and it was really distressing to see. But what it also did, well, unfortunately, because they did it consistently, is that it couldn't be contested at the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, because Ontario Human Rights does not sorry, I'm a little lost for words today, but it does not cover, human rights is not extended to people who have been justice involved in terms of access to housing. But the international definition, however, does, and that does apply to Canada. So there is a clash between, the federal, or what is considered federal jurisdiction around access to housing and discrimination of access to housing, and then what's happening at the provincial level. So that needs to be addressed, because that contradiction really exists. And, anyone who has been justice involved needs housing as well. So just because that, this is a chapter of their lives, doesn't mean that they deserve to be unhoused for the rest of their life.
Yeah, and that also goes towards those who are experiencing addictions and meeting them where they're at. And it also speaks a bit to one more issue with co-signing or checking credit. So those are things I think also to keep in mind. And that goes into the question, I think, about invisible homelessness. So how are you addressing that demographic of invisible homelessness? And how much feedback so far have you gotten from those with lived experience through the submission process?
I can't speak to the submission process yet. We do, well, before I went to BC, I did read all the submissions that we received from BC, just so that I could be immediately familiar with the submissions we've received so far. That being said, it's a good to look out for. Hidden homelessness has always been something of concern, especially with my 5 years with Action Logement. The point in time counts that the municipalities do admit that that is a big missing piece of their data, and proper data collection is really important in order to justify our work, justify programs, justify, and to tell the story of the sector, of the housing and homelessness sector. But we also know that women have been disproportionately been part of hidden homelessness, that it's easier for women to exchange sex and care for a place to live. But, even then, it is not secure. It means placing women in danger, in being in relationships they don't want to be in, relationships that are there's disproportionate amount of, or a power imbalance, or that are violent. And this needs to be addressed. And I think we need further conversations on how to capture or how to identify these numbers, but then also find real solutions. So it's one thing to have the stats, and then it's another thing to say, well, okay, now what? So the now what is also really, really important. That needs to be developed in tandem.
Thank you. I don't see any hands up, so I'll keep asking the questions that have been written in the chat. Oh, I do see one hand up there. Corey, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. I'm in BC. I'm with the BC Society of Transition Houses. And so, of course, our member agencies are, sorry, I have smoke throat today. It's really, really smoky out here right now. So, because people are burning the downtown east side, just so that you want to know, just in case you want to know how people what length people will go to fight with to fight against inequality in their lives, right? So one of the things that I think that we need to recognize is that the intersectional nature of all of our human rights as Indigenous people, and also as human beings walking on the earth, right? I think that we need to, it's so easy to fall into the silo trap where you're only responding to one part, and then the other parts don't get touched. So if there's some way that, so I guess my question to you is, how good are you at fighting silos, man? That's my question to you.
I laugh. In French, we have a really good expression called rire jaune, which means laughing yellow. And it's a bit of an ironic laugh, or just, wow, okay. And I think this is the billion-dollar question, to be quite honest. And we're looking at ways to, it's not just Minister Hussein's jurisdiction. It's not just federal jurisdiction or provincial jurisdiction. It's, I see health. We also are looking at, environment, where we're looking at, that health is a big one. And then with ISK and CERNAC, and, getting the right people at the table to recognize that we can't have turf wars, or even worse. It's like the volleyball court where, everyone goes, oh, it's yours, it's yours, it's yours. And then y'all look at each other and the ball drops between two hands. Like, this needs to stop. And, it is a question of human lives and human dignity on the line, but it is also billions of dollars on the line. And, so the silo busting is really some of my priorities, because it is such a waste. But then, we can bring back the conversation about health and housing, to the breakdown of mental health system and the dismantling, and rightfully so, of some of the practices that were happening in the 80s, but then without having a plan for what would happen to people and where they would live. And that fell to the housing sector without extra funding or without any extra resources. So thank goodness we have organizations on the ground like Ottawa Inner City Health, for example, in Ottawa, that I knew about, and I've seen some in Vancouver, Victoria. But that being said, they can't do it all. And even them, there's things that they're allowed to fund and not allowed to fund because of these silo issues. And it's just really, but we can also, make it, push that we can make it happen through the federal leadership, through multilateral and bilateral agreements, having the strings attached to the big purses that are being announced. And, we are pushing for outcomes, but the outcomes should also include collaboration.
Thank you. I believe Khulud's hand is up next.
I just had a follow-up question to the earlier point that you just mentioned, Marie-Josée, which was around how provincial human rights tribunal cover a certain length, and then hopefully some of the rights that are covered under NHSA through the affirmation of the international human rights law can probably drive some accountability to things like access to housing and access to justice and housing and criminal record checks and stuff. I just want to know, like, the Federal Housing Advocate and the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, what can it do, or like what sort of policy recommendations it can make to influence policy at provincial levels, and particularly when it comes to access to justice issues and taking individual issues to human rights tribunals and Human Rights Commission.
Yeah, because that's where the individual claims go, and we're trying to figure that out of how this can be realized, and it's a very it's a very big question. As you know, the right to housing can be realized in so many different ways, and there's so many issues to look at. Our role really is, we make recommendations, but then we can also work with other, it's kind of push the relationships or push multilateral and bilateral agreements, so to address some of these issues. We're also leaving a paper trail, in any way, shape, or form. And this is something that we've had a discussion. I recently met with the former human rights commissioner from South Africa, and they had a huge mandate around housing as a human right as well. So he's really interested in the National Housing Strategy Act and the role of the Federal Housing Advocate and the mechanisms. Now, we know that litigation takes decades, and quite often when we get to litigation, the people for whom we're fighting and tying up millions of dollars are dead by the time we get a response, or we get to a final decision on things. And I think Indigenous people know more than anyone that there's the do you negotiate or do you litigate? And even after litigation, there's still more negotiation. So are there better ways to do this, through working tables, through mediation, through but if ever there is a clash action suit, some of the things that we're looking at is leaving a paper trail, a body of work where, for example, the letters to mayors, so that jurisdictions are, no one can say that they didn't know about the human right to housing and what this means and how the way they're acting is in violation. And so that we can be used also as a friend of the court for some of these more, class action suits. So, Khulud, I'm glad you asked that question. It's a big, important question, and it, because this is a new mechanism, I feel we need to try every way possible and have our fingers in many pies, and like I said, leave breadcrumbs all over the place.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking that on, Marie-José.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes left, and we're going to go to Beverly because Beverly had her hand up.
Hi there. Okay, let me see if I can take my hand down. Okay. So before we came back to this room here, I was in the other room and this big, huge hook came and snagged me out right when I was going on about my perceptions of our federal government's distinctions-based approach to the way that they do things. And I kind of think like, and I may not be articulating this really well, but from my perspective, you know, we have a federal government who, and it's a political hot potato thing really, but they have this distinctions-based approach to how they allocate funding and make those decisions. And oftentimes, inadvertently, that leaves a large segment of the population out. It's all of the folks that are living in the urban and rural centers who are struggling with the encampments, who are struggling with lack of housing options and lack of supports. Those are where the dollars are needed, sort of on the ground. And I'm wondering, you know, I see that a lot of the municipalities get burdened with the costs of taking care of that issue. And they don't get a lot of support from the provincial governments. So I'm wondering about, is there something that, you know, urban, rural, and municipal organizations and governments can do to challenge the distinctions-based approach that the federal government has decided upon? You know, do we need a Jordan's principle for housing? Like, you know, in 2016, okay, so here's another little, in 2016, the Daniels decision came about. The Supreme Court gave a ruling that for that, you know, unaffiliated Métis and non-status individuals were Indians for the purposes of federal parliament's lawmaking jurisdiction under section 9124 of the Constitution Act. But it also implied that the federal government holds legal responsibility to legislate on issues related to Métis and non-status Indians. So oftentimes what I see is that provincial governments defer financial responsibility to the federal government. And so all of our funding dollars for housing tend to go through the AFN, the Métis National Council, and ITK, leaving all of the urban and rural off-reserve folks kind of in a bit of a pinch. And the example that I was giving before was with the Community Support Fund when COVID first hit. You know, those three national Indigenous organizations received very large sums of money to support their members through COVID. Whereas the, you know, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples and the Native Women's Association of NWAC, anyhow, received very few dollars, but the folks that are off reserve, we know, I mean, 80% or whatever, 87% of Indigenous people no longer live on reserves. So, and they're living in our urban centers. So what do you see, or is there anything that you see organizations or, you know, municipal governments, provincial governments, are there things that we could be doing to support raising that voice and creating a louder a level of awareness around maybe this federal government needs to reassess this distinctions-based approach? That's my rant.
Good rant, Beverly. I think it's a really important one to have, and this is something that we've heard consistently across the country. Is, you know, distinctions-based has a lot of people that slip through the cracks, even if distinctions-based funding is for, you know, is might have access to an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing program, you know, that is off community. The reality that we're hearing is that a lot of people's journey is from community to off community to maybe back to community to, you know, people are mobile, and in the end, all people should be allowed to live where they choose to live for whatever reason and for however long. And my family moved from one province. Well, I moved from one province to another, but my parents moved from northern Quebec to Alberta for survival, basically. And if I was able to do it, why shouldn't anyone else, right? And we had a safety net. We had a soft landing. We landed in Alberta. We landed in Edmonton. My family lived in subsidized housing for a year. And, you know, and it was really important for our survival. That being said, you know, there are Indigenous housing experts out there. Whether or not they, you know, are able to, you know, pronounce themselves as the housing experts, and they are the ones who should be the ones to manage the for Indigenous by Indigenous funds. You know, or is it distinctions based? We know that distinctions based, that people have multiple, you know, that have multiple or no status, even though they are Indigenous. You know, they might have a mother that's Métis and a father that's First Nations, and yet, you know, people slip through the cracks in so many ways, or they're just not status, and yet there's an obligation. So there's the obligation, then there is the, I think, UNDRIP and UNDRIP, I think has governments really scared. They don't want to do this wrong. So then what happens, and what we're trying to discourage, is that, you know, they would come up to the circle and then just throw in a bunch of money and then run away. Okay, go do, you know. But not all organizations, not all are able, or they need the support. Some are fine, but, you know, across this country, and the country is very vast, not every group has everything they need, or the expertise, or the economies of scale to do this well. So it's not just a matter of throwing money at it. It's to do it well, to support, to leverage. So that responsibility is not just financial. It is everything else. And with that, you know, we're really hoping to get better data, and to, you know, again, through some of these funding agreements, that there is the proper collection of data, and not just counting people and structures, but having outcomes related data. And there's a reluctance to do that. And we need to keep hammering that home, because in order to be able to measure, you know, the realization of right to housing, we need outcomes and not just outputs. So, you know, again, it's not a simple thing, but, you know, what is very clear, as you said, there's people that are failed. So, you know, but the discourse that we've heard, one that struck with me again, I'm speaking about BC, well, it's only because I was there. The discourse that we've heard, or that some women have been in their communities, experienced trauma in their community, decide to leave, find themselves in Vancouver, land homeless, go through years of process and additional trauma, different traumas, finally end up in supportive housing or affordable housing, or housing that's appropriate for them. And they make this incredible journey of recovery to some way, and then decide to connect to their community. And they go to their community, and sometimes their community shames them for their journey, for the things that they've had to do to survive. And so then they come back to Vancouver and start from zero again, and are preyed upon again, and are part of human trafficking, or, you know, involved in relationships that they don't want to be in for survival. And, you know, this narrative needs to be spoken over and over again, because the journey of travel and travel of jurisdiction is, you know, it has to be front and center of a lot of these conversations around solutions.
Thank you. I'm an Edmontonian as well too. Here I am. And I know there are several organizations in the city, and the city itself, everybody's working really hard to address these issues and these gaps. And so, you know, anything that I'm with the Indigenous Congress of Alberta, anything that we can do to help out, you know, that I think working together and supporting one another is really important. So thank you.
Thanks, Beverly, for your question.
We're going to move to see Dwayne Campbell. He's had his hand up for quite some time.
It's okay. I love these questions so far. My comment, first of all, was I don't like how we count homeless people. The point of time makes no sense. It never has. Why don't we just count everything that way? Let's do criminal stats that way. It makes it just blows my head away. I like how Seattle, I think it is, how they did it. They approached it like point of time, but they also involved, I tried to look up this information, I can't find it. But they involved hospitals and a lot of other things that homeless people interact with. And I'm trying to contact people with the Observatory Homeless Canada. I always get it mixed up. To see if we can get some funding and do a study like in 5 different cities to try to do the count, I think, properly. But that's just a comment. The other concern I have is, does the federal government actually communicate with municipalities? Because municipalities have the anti-affordable housing bylaws all the time. So the federal government really has to talk with the municipalities to try to remove this, because it's the biggest hurdle to build new housing or affordable housing.
Wow. There's so much to unpack here. First of all, you know, I love, no, this is great because you're having me think about a lot of things, and I'm glad this meeting is going to be recorded because there's all these amazing nuggets of information and building blocks, you know, starting points for us to consider, for us to think about when we're, you know, and to understand in a fulsome and more holistic way. There's so many moving parts, but around, you know, what you're suggesting around the PINT count and what Seattle has done is to have, you know, it is part of busting, right? I don't know how many people stay in hospital beds where it's incredibly expensive to keep people because there's no housing for them if they're being released, or even Jesse Thistle's story, who was released after his surgery into homelessness. So what's the point of putting him through surgery, right? So, yep, go ahead.
They're not counting people staying in hospital beds.
Okay.
It's the amount of homeless people in hospitals that they know are homeless. So they're keeping track of the homeless people using that resource.
I see.
So it's another way of keeping track of numbers of homeless people.
Right. So what we're looking at,
because like you can never expect anyone to stay in a hospital bed in the States unless basically you're rich.
Yeah, or it's nonprofit, or it's no, that's an exact point. But I've, you know, in some of the developments that I've was involved with for nonprofits, or we had accessible units that we needed to fill, and one of the units we filled with someone who was in the hospital, and he was deliberately kept in the hospital because there was no place for him. So, you know, but I think this is a brilliant idea, but it has a lot to do with coordinated access and shared data collection. And, you know, what happens to people, you know, having a kind of a sector-wide approach to care. And that's not just municipal or provincial, but trans-Canada. And when I mention that, people look at me like I have 5 heads, because it's just so hard to even have that municipal level kind of database of what happens to people, the warm handoff. Can we have you know, a plan with people over the long term, and then not just go, okay, well, you're done with us, so you know your 2 years of supportive housing are done, so off you go, here's the next step for you, or you've aged out of youth care, and so now you get to go to, oh, we don't know, have fun, good luck, you know, hope you don't end up homeless where everyone else goes. We do need better transitions. We need warm handoffs through that discussion, but then that also includes the silo busting. And I've been approached by many researchers in my last position about, you know, a lot of these issues, especially around accessibility, people with, you know, who need accessible housing. That being said, do the municipalities and the federal government have conversations? What I've heard by listening to the Canadian Urban Institute during the pandemic, I live alone, so the Canadian Urban Institute was my best friend, my big companion during the pandemic. I learned a lot, and what I heard was a lot of, you know, municipalities wanting to have direct relationships with the federal government, because using the third party of the province was just really difficult. So I'm hoping we're going to see a lot more direct, but that, you know, we need better regional coordination as well. You know, some of the things that we heard when we were in Vancouver is the high concentration of need in Vancouver because there are resources, and a way for other suburbs to not have homelessness is to not accept to have resources for people who are homeless. And so, or not have any supports, or not have any housing, or not have anything. And that the environment is so hostile that anyone who is precariously housed wouldn't dare go there, and they're going to go to the downtown east side. So, you know, we need more regional efforts. Things need to be spread out. We're talking about scale, economies of scale, but then not having too big of scale. And also, where there's large concentrations of people who are suffering, you're going to have large concentrations of predators. So again, you know, that perpetuates a deeper issue, and not just for the people who are unhoused themselves, but for the other people living in the community. And so you get tons of NIMBYism. So that's a chicken egg conversation, but it needs, you know, we just can't have high concentrations of people in Vancouver or in, you know, large centers. And that's not always where people want to be living either. So how all of this ties together, it's very complex, but I think we need to look at it, the big picture. And that's where, you know, municipalities need to be talking with the federal government. Did I answer your question at all? I see you've got it kind of. Do you want to do a follow-up question a little bit?
It's more about the anti-affordable housing bylaws that a lot of the big cities have, that we have no problem building expensive condominiums. We have no problem building apartment blocks, and they classify starting at $2,000 as affordable.
Yeah.
It's getting the federal government to talk with the municipalities that it would really help that if you remove this hurdle, developers, nonprofits, everyone else can actually build housing. Bylaws against tiny homes, bylaws about, it's that sort of thing that the cities are thinking about money all the time. And they don't realize that putting a person in a house costs roughly half as much as keeping them on the streets. So building the house is cheaper in the long run. But they're thinking of the short term. How can we get taxes? How can we do this? How can developers make profits so they can actually support me in my next election? It's that circular logic they have. They're not thinking about these bylaws are stopping us from actually building affordable housing.
Okay, now I understand what you mean. Yeah, and that you have a city council that's stacked towards, you know, more the financialization of housing, or that they're looking at what their tax base is, and their tax base is, property taxes. And that's their big source of income. So the higher the homes are valued, the more that they have, or development fees, that are leveraged. Yeah, this all plays into the equation. And then of course there's the NIMBYism. So yeah, municipalities have a lot at play. That being said, some municipalities also, the homelessness is happening in their turf, and they're the ones who are being told, fix this, even though it's more, the affordability part is, and the development part is the provincial jurisdiction. So, who screams the loudest in the equation of everything? This comes down to a lot of proper city planning. I understand Edmonton went through a really great 10-year, not 10-year plan, but a development plan for the next 25, 30 years, which included a lot of things that were, pretty progressive. But, recognizing that you need mixed income neighborhoods everywhere. And what is the urban plan for municipalities? And you have to make it happen, because even if you frame it through climate change, a housing crisis is a climate crisis. If people, every neighborhood needs people to clean schools and serve coffee, and or as people change housing in their different stages of life, or if they go through divorce, everyone needs a place to go. And the sticker shock of entering the rental market after 20 years of being a homeowner has awakened, let's just say, the middle class to the issue of housing affordability. And the big one, you nailed it, was the definition of what is affordable, because it's different from one municipality to another, and it needs to be consistent. And that level of affordability is not relative to everyone else who lives in that city. It needs to be around core housing need, and how much people are paying for their housing relative to their income. So, so that one is, is being looked at by a lot of key players, I would say, some good advocates in the political sphere in different municipalities, but it's not ignored. It's been very well highlighted. Let's just hope they get somewhere. Now I answered your question? Kind of? Okay, okay, thank you.
We're coming close to our 3:20 mark, and maybe have just like time for one last question. I don't know if Katlia has joined us again. I know Katlia got dropped off the call. Oh, she's right there. Awesome. So we just have time for one quick question, and then we'll head to closing remarks.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I had my computer charging, but it turned out it wasn't, and it started getting all crackly and fuzzy, and then yeah. So just one last question here. It's a pretty important one. So while supportive housing is a great idea, here in BC Housing has health coordinators that interview potential candidates with intrusive questions, and the interview takes about 45 minutes. These interviews can trigger PTSD. Supporting housing creates rules such as no guests and request ID of guests. This was challenged in courts. There was a precedent set. However, housing providers continue to implement these rules. And Indigenous peoples who have been interviewed, did a tour of such housing, have expressed that it reminds them of Indian residential schools. So the Rental Tenancy Act needs to include supportive housing. SROs and BC Housing also needs to revisit how these assess potential tenants.
Absolutely. And if you're looking at, well, I think what concerned me a lot with the BC supportive housing models was that it's not housing first of all. And it's certainly not human rights based, because it doesn't even start with a lease. That most of them start with program agreements, so that it's up to the sole discretion of the landlord to throw someone out with 24 hours notice. And we heard that a lot when we were in encampments. So, and the pushback we got from housing providers was that they need to be able to evict people very quickly because it is life endangerment. But, you know, people don't even have access to a rights, you know, our justice mechanism at all. And so they have no rights, period. So it's, you know, so the people that this kind of system has failed, we found them in encampments. It's not just about pets and guests. It's about even being able to have their grandchildren there. We've heard of some housing providers that charge $25 per guest, and you don't even have that in prison. So I don't mean to be, you know, it's like, you know, to add hyperbole to this equation, but I was shocked, because that's not what I know of supportive housing. And maybe what I know of how supportive housing is housing with supports, more through, you know, housing first framework, choice-based framework. But, you know, at the same time, what was very clear to us is the underfunding of these organizations and their operating, and the pressures that they're under as well. And they can't keep their employees. Their employees don't feel safe. They're not properly trained. They're certainly not trauma informed. And that they're, you know, the meager resources that they have for operating and also for capital maintenance has just forced them into operating in a way that is so punitive and that doesn't respect human rights to housing in the least. So it's a big problem. It's manifested in a lot of ways, but I think it also needs to be, it leads to some overhauls in BC's RTA. If the issue is, you know, around eviction, that it can't happen fast enough, you know, is there a way to fast track life endangerment and you know, other life-threatening reasons to have someone evicted, so that someone doesn't stay for 3-4 months, as the housing providers are stating, and to probably fund the RTA. But in the end, it's that person will still be able to be heard, and it's not the landlord that makes the ultimate decision about whether or not they can stay. So it's a big issue, but it's certainly one that's on our radar. But on the other hand, there's other provinces that have better supportive housing definitions and programs, and that are certainly not as not punitive, and that do start at the very beginning, which is a lease.
Thank you. Yes, that's very important. And a lot of these transitional centers do not have lease agreements and are easily able to evict tenants. So that's good to note. I think that that's all the time that we really have today. I really want to just thank you for your time and your presence today, and listening and being a part of this important discussion. This is an ever-evolving conversation that's going to continue to be had. We know that there's an emergency right now, so there's long-term and short-term objectives, and we're going to just continue to work with you along the way. And what we've noticed in the chat is that we have a lot of very direct comments. So not so much questions, but these are action items and comments that people really want to make sure are included. And so we'll wrap that up for you and submit that to you with their consent, of course. And I think from our discussion today, we can really sum it up as that we've really discussed affordability, accessibility, discrimination, the need for you, Marie, in your role to continue to listen to Indigenous women and girls in particular, as that's very, very important, and gender diverse people as well. So thank you, Masi Cho, so much for your time today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I am really humbled to hear your stories and to be able to engage with you. So thank you so much to everyone who is here.
And we will do a closing now, again, hopefully from Sally. I'm not sure if she's still here.
I think Sally said her phone died, so I'm wondering if Kathy, you and Marie could close us, and just wanted to thank everyone for participating today.
Marie, I think if you don't mind, would you like to close? Thank you.
Thank you everyone for participating, for very serious questions to consider, some thoughtful comments offered, and for participating and joining in this group. I realize that we're scattered all across the country in very many different places with very many different experiences. So I'll close off by asking us to go back to that exercise we did this morning, where we imagined a smoke from the sage or cedar or tobacco or sweetgrass. And remember that we asked for clear thinking when we wafted the smoke over our heads. And we asked for being able to see clearly when we wafted the smoke over our eyes and over our ears to hear and listen, and also over our mouths so that we would be able to say good things, and over our hearts symbolically for good intent. And that also we symbolically washed our hands so that everything that we did today, that we did and we made, was done in a good way for good purposes. So I'd like to ask you to reflect on that exercise and ask yourselves, yes, did we do all those things we said we were going to do? And if you answer yes, that's a good thing. And if you answered no, well, we continue living and experiencing and learning. And we never stop learning, even as time goes by, and time goes by quickly. So I just wanted to say Chimigwech for sharing today, asking questions, talking, being part of the group. Chimigwech, miigwech, miigwech, miigwech. Now.
Okay, take care, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful week ahead. Thank you very much.